Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, we are going to be talking about something that I am so excited about, and that is beginner science fiction books. So if you are a person who maybe hasn't really read a ton of science fiction and would like to read more, this is a video for you. Why am I doing this? Well, recently I did a video that was the New Year's book tag, and one of the questions was, what genre would you like to read more of? And I said science fiction as one of them. And after that, I was like, I should just kind of do a little bit of research and figure out what books I should start with. And then I started looking at lists. And you guys, the lists are kind of terrible, in my opinion, because almost all of them are heavily populated by classic science fiction books. And I personally do not feel that classic science fiction is a good place to start. And the reason why is just because a lot of them are from like the 50s and 60s, which means that they have a very different writing style. And if you read a lot of modern fiction, it's just going to feel very, very different. And I just don't think that you should have to work really hard to understand the writing style when you're also trying to work to understand the science fiction part. Number two, a lot of them are bigoted. They are a product of their time, and some of the bigotry is very minor and some of it is very overt and large, and you have to be able to overlook it to enjoy the story. And I think that that's a really difficult thing to do, again, when you're also trying to figure out if you like the science fiction aspect of it. And then number three, so science fiction at its very core asks, what if? Right? They take the status quo for the society that they are in at the time that they are in it, and they say, what if? What if we had spaceships? What if, all genders were treated equally? What if? There's so many different what ifs that we can ask. And at its very core, those what ifs are based off of the society that we are in at the time that we are in it. And when we're talking about the 50s and 60s, that is a very different society in many ways than what we live with now. And so the questions that they're asking don't always make sense. Sometimes they do, and sometimes we can really relate to it, but not all the time. And so for that reason, I don't think that for most people, classics are the right way to start. And let me put a caveat on this. I do think classics are worthwhile, and a lot of people like them for a good reason. They are popular novels. I just don't necessarily think it's the right place to start when you're just getting into science fiction. So if I don't think that classics is the way to go, then what do I think what's a great place to start? Well, let's talk about how I determined the books on this list. I came up with 3 qualifications. Number 1, it has to be science fiction. And this actually was really difficult because I was looking for books that were science fiction and something else. So science fiction and horror, science fiction and mystery, so that the science fiction portion of it never really overran the plot. But it has to be heavily enough science fiction that you get a good idea of if you like this genre or not. If it's so science fiction light that you can't figure that out, that's not a good place to necessarily begin. Number 2, I have to have read it. I'm sure that I am leaving off a number of really great beginner science fiction books, but I'm leaving them off because I haven't read them. Since this list is a little bit counter to most of the beginner lists out there, I can't really rely on other people's opinions, so I have to have read it. And then number 3, it has to be based on science, but not heavily into that science. So one of the reasons that most of us are a little bit wary of science fiction is that there's so much science that we're worried we're just going to glaze over because oh my gosh, I just don't care about how the warp drive works, right? And so with that, I made sure that it is science based, but it's not, we're not going to get authors waxing poetic about the science of things. Except for one notable exception, and that is for my people who don't read science fiction because they actually really love science fiction and they hate that the authors get it wrong. If you're one of those people, I do have a book for you. But other than that, every other one does not have super heavy science in it. So with that very long intro, let's jump right into the list. And I'm going to start with the series that I think is actually probably the best overall. And that is the Murderbot Diaries by Martha Wells. This is a series about Murderbot. Murderbot is a sort of robot that happens to have some organic components to it, i.e. like body parts. And essentially, they have hacked the software that tells them what to do. So if a human tells them something to do, they are required to do it. And this software kind of punishes them if they don't. So they've hacked that software so that they do not have to actually listen to any humans. And of course, they choose to listen to the humans anyway and continue doing their job, which is actually to keep the humans safe as they go to other worlds to kind of explore. So they do their job and then they go back to their room and they watch some TV shows. That is what Murderbot does. And of course, when we first meet Murderbot in All Systems Red, this is what they have been doing for a while, but now their humans are in trouble and they have to make a decision to go against their training and actually save these humans in a way that would not be possible if that software wasn't hacked or if they continue doing the same thing. I think that this is a really great place to start because all 4 of these books are really short. They're novellas. They're only 150 pages each. If you are an average reader, that's an afternoon. So it's not a huge investment. And I think that that's really, really great because people who recommend 1,000-page science fiction stories to beginners, that makes me want to cry. That's not great. Like, I don't want to invest in 1,000 pages, right? But 150, I can do that. I also think that this is really great if you love action, a lot of action. These are very, very heavily action oriented, and it's really interesting to watch Murderbot make their decisions because in every single novel, they are trying to protect some group of humans and they have to come up with a strategy for how they're going to approach a specific situation. And of course, as always, something goes wrong. So they have to use their tactics on the fly to change the plan. And it's very interesting to see what Murderbot comes up with to keep these humans safe. And honestly, if you're into character development, this has some really, really nice character development of Murderbot. When we first meet them, they really just want to do their job and watch TV. That's all they want. And so they have to confront this idea of, are they a person? And if so, what kind of person do they want to be? And by the end, Murderbot has made some interesting and believable decisions about what kind of person they want to be. And watching that journey is very, very cool. However, the big downside of this is that the world building is there, but it's not super explicit. And we're not really given a whole lot of explanation in the beginning. So I'm the type of person that I want the world to be explained to me explicitly very early on. So I struggled a little bit with this because it just doesn't do that. It drops you in the world, and if you're familiar with modern technology, you should have enough of an understanding to get by. But it does not hold your hand, and that has to be okay. I do think that there's enough that you can still enjoy the story, but if you're like me and need some explicit world building on the upfront, or you really like to have a lot of world building, then this might not be the right place to start. Number two. This is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. And this, you guys, is a straight up romance. It's so good. And it is a romance between 2 time-traveling agents who are from mutually exclusive future timelines. And their job is to go back into the past and change events enough to kind of secure the future of their timeline. And they're from mutually exclusive timelines, so one cannot exist in the future if they can't both exist together. And really, this is about two people who are rivals, who recognize that they have found a worthy opponent, and they just become, that admiration eventually turns into love. This is really a romance with a science fiction setting. Again, this is also a very, very short book, only about 200 pages, so not a huge time investment. If you are the type of person who is coming from more of a literary fiction background, where you really like that lyrical kind of beautiful language, this is very, very nice. I thought the language in this was just absolutely beautiful. The two main characters are women, so there is some beautiful queer representation there. And also, if you're maybe not super excited about the romance but willing to give it a try, this also has some of the most amazing what if kind of scenarios. So we all do this, right? Like, what if I made a different decision? What would my future be like? Well, in this, the characters are literally going back in time. And like, for example, one of the scenes is one of the agents is in a cave trying to string together some bones to make a whistle so that when this particular gust of wind goes by, it makes a sound, and it's right as this person is walking by, which triggers this thought, which changes their completely changes their future. Like, that's what we're dealing with, which is such a really cool thought experiment. So if you're into that it is very strong in this one, and that is very cool. The only con that I would say with this one is that when we do get to the ending, there is all of a sudden a lot more science fiction kind of stuff. So if you're into romances, you'll probably recognize this as the big heroic gesture moment, the I have to take care of this problem so that me and my lady love can be together, because that's what it is. And so if you know that, you don't necessarily have to completely understand what's going on, because you understand the purpose of it. But to me, it was very, very jarring that it wasn't super science fiction heavy. It was a science fiction setting, but it wasn't super sciencey until we got to this ending. And then it was just like, what? And so because of that, just be aware. Just be aware that all of a sudden it kind of gets very sciencey. But as long as you understand that one of the characters is doing this so that they can be together with their love, you should be just fine, even if you don't 100% understand. After that, my next recommendation is actually an entire author, and that is John Scalzi. And John Scalzi is actually called a gateway science fiction author because he writes these novels that are so easy to read. It doesn't, I mean, this is where a lot of people get their start, because his novels are just so easy to read and they just happen to be science fiction. He's very, very good at not overloading the science. It's also very, if you are into science, it's very clear that he did all his research, but he's just very good at picking out the most important parts so that the science makes sense for all our science people, but it's not overloading the story for, everybody else. His stories are very, very story driven. And sorry, I meant to hold this up. I do have my 2 copies of his books, Lock In and Head On. They're part of the series that I personally love. The other really great thing about John Scalzi is that he has written in a number of subgenres. So he has Red Shirts, which is straight up Star Trek satire. You have Little Fuzzy, which is a love letter to a classic science fiction by Little Fuzzy. The John Scalzi novel is Fuzzy Nation. The original is Little Fuzzy by H. Beam Piper. And that's much more about like alien species interactions. And then you've got Lock-In, which is like near future, what would our world look like if we had this medical emergency with this very specific side effect. You have Old Man's War, which is military sci-fi, and I haven't read that one. but he's got a lot of different subgenres. So if you don't like one, but you like the writing style, you can try something else and see if maybe a different subgenre works better for you, which is so cool. The downside to John Scalzi is that he is so focused on the storyline that the world building is not, there's not a lot of world building. There's enough to get the story going, but it's not a ton. The character development, not a ton. I will put a caveat and say that I have not read his series. So I don't know if the character development gets better over the series, but honestly, at least in the standalones that I read and the first book of Lock-In, the characters are really there to further the plot along. So if you're into character development, you're just going to have to accept that this is not what he does a lot of. After that, number 4, we are going to talk about a young adult novel series, and that is The Lunar Chronicles by Marissa Mayer. And that one starts with Cinder. And it is a 4-book series. There is also a novella as well as a book of short stories. And I actually think, I'm going to hold these up like this. So I think that young adult novels are actually a really, really great place to start for exploring genres in general. Why? Because young adult novels, they don't have super complicated storylines. They have very narrowly focused storylines, which can make things a little bit easier. If you're not having to work to like understand the storyline, that's just easier. And the storyline itself is often focused on things that are relevant to teenagers, namely, who am I as a person and how do I want to be in this world? And like, what kind of an adult do I want to be? Which is ultimately very relatable for so many of us because we had that conversation as a teenager. We might still be having that conversation with ourselves as like adults, but we recognize it as a teenager. And again, because it's so relatable, that means that this is a series, like those are stories that really make sense. And additionally, again, not over complicating things. The cast of characters itself tends to be very focused. You're not going to get 50 characters in the novel. I'm looking at you, George R. R. Martin. There's not like, there generally doesn't even need to be family trees at the beginning. It's a smaller cast of characters with a very focused plot line. And so young adult novels are actually really nice. Why did I choose the Lunar Chronicles specifically? These are all fairy tale retellings. So this first book of Cinder is actually a Cinderella retelling. Scarlet, it's about Little Red Riding Hood. Cress is Rapunzel. And then the last book, Winter, that's Snow White. And so when we have something like a fairy tale retelling, it's a storyline that's very familiar. We know the big plot points. We know that Cinderella, our Cinderella stand-in, is going to be working for some people who don't appreciate her. We know that there's going to be this party or a ball or something where she gets to dance with her love interest. She leaves that party, ball, whatever, abruptly and leaves something behind that love interest can track her down with. We know those plot points, and it just makes it so much easier to focus on the science fiction and figuring out that part of it when we already have an idea of where this story is going. Additionally, I like this series because this is it's a science fiction setting. This one happens to be more heavily science fiction, but Scarlet is actually more fantasy. And then Cress goes back to the more science fiction part, and then Winter is again more heavily fantasy-esque. This is a very character and plot-driven story, so even though it is science fiction setting, so very heavily science fiction, it is still very character and plot driven. Now, the big downside for this particular series and in general dealing with young adult is the tropes. You have to be okay with young adult tropes. Some of us are just like, can't really deal with that because, hey, I left high school. I have no desire to go back to the drama they're in. And I get that. So if you are unfamiliar with young adult tropes, then this might be harder to start with. You just have to kind of know already that you're okay with the young adult tropes. After that, number 5, the one that I think I might get the most flack for, and that is the In-Depth series by J.D. Robb. For anybody who doesn't know, J.D. Robb is actually a pen name for Nora Roberts. And the story goes that in the 80s, she was writing so quickly that she was producing more books, romance books, than the publishing houses wanted to actually publish in a year. She was limited to 2 romances a year. And she's like, I write a lot faster than that, so I gotta find something to do. And so what she famously did is she came up with her pen name of J.D. Robb and started writing these mysteries, the In-Depth mystery series. It is a mystery series with a science fiction setting. And there are just a ton of books if you like them. If you like this series, there's over 50 books now, which is somewhat intimidating, but you don't have to read them all because they're very, very episodic. So a good mystery series tends to be very focused on the mystery. And when you're so focused on the mystery of this particular book, then it feels very episodic. The character development that happens through the series is very background. And so you can jump into book 10 and not really understand all the different parts of how the characters have developed over the series to enjoy that mystery. They are very well written mysteries. And one reason why I think that this is really good is that it was written in the 80s and it was written as a near future kind of thing. So J.D. Robb, Nora Roberts, got a lot of this science fiction stuff gloriously wrong. It feels almost very strange because she was so wrong about it. And so it almost feels like an alternate universe where we do keep data on disks instead of like flash drives or anything like that. And if you actually like looking at, okay, in the past, this is what they thought the future was going to be like, then you might actually, that might be a really good indicator that you will like classic science fiction. And I think that that's a really good thing to have. Some of the big cons of this is that it is amazingly repetitive with character development. Like you have to get reminded of all these stuff because it is so in the background. And that development is incredibly slow. So like, for example, when we first meet our main character of Eve, it is very clear that she had a very traumatic childhood. And we don't find out the full extent of that trauma until like book 10 or something like that. Even though we get hints along the way, which for me personally, I find to be just a little bit annoying. But it is very indicative of the genre, of the mystery part of the genre. And while we are talking about that background, I do want to say that there are content warnings on this book for child abuse and rape. And it is not just one character, it is multiple characters. So be very cautious if that is something that you need to avoid. Okay? Number 6, tie-in novels. So, this is for people who actually like science fiction media and just haven't read the science fiction. So it might be a really nice place to start with whatever media you're into and see if they have any tie-in novels. Star Wars, Star Trek, Stargate, Battlestar Galactica. Points if you know where that little quote is from. But if that's what you like, a lot of those things have tie-in novels. And so it can be a really nice place to start because you're already familiar with the world, you're familiar with a lot of the characters, so you can get used to reading a science fiction novel. I know also Warhammer 40K is one that a lot of people like who actually read it. The downside of this is just for people who already know that they like science fiction media and just haven't read anything yet. But the other downside is you're going to need to do your own research. So there's, for example, a lot of Star Wars tie-in novels, and some are good and some are amazing, and you kind of have to do your research into which ones are the ones that people tend to like. And yeah, not everybody wants to do the research, and I totally understand that. Number 7, Feed by Mira Grant. And this is the one that I was actually a little bit wary of putting on the list because I wasn't sure it was science fiction enough. But I was leaning towards it, and then I found a list where John Scalzi, previously mentioned John Scalzi, actually recommended this as a good starting point. So I said, if John Scalzi recommends it, I can recommend it too. This is a mishmash of science fiction and horror and a little bit political thriller. But essentially we are following 2 adoptive siblings who are bloggers, and they have been asked to follow a presidential candidate on their campaign trail, and things start going wrong in like kind of the worst possible way when you're dealing with zombies, and so they have to figure out what's going on. I love this book. So because it is a mishmash of horror and science fiction and this political thriller kind of thing, it's very science fiction light, but it is a near future where there are zombies. The zombie apocalypse has happened, and we as a society have learned to deal with it essentially. But the reason I feel very comfortable including this is because the reason we have zombies is very science-based. Essentially, there were 2 guys in different parts of the world. One was working with viruses to see if he could get a cure for the common cold, and the other one was working with a different virus to see if they could get a cure for cancer. And these 2 viruses met up and formed a super virus, and it cures the common cold, and it cures cancer, and it raises the dead. And everybody is infected with it. So it's not even something you can get away from. And so because of that very science background for this zombie, as well as the fact that it is in the future, I decided that I was comfortable including this. It is also very horror light. If you're into horror, zombie horror, this is not actually zombie horror. This is more psychological horror. The whole, I have built this world so amazingly well that you can actually see that this might be the future, and it keeps you up at night kind of horror. In that vein, the world building is phenomenal. Mira Grant is a pen name for Shauna Maguire, and Shauna Maguire is known for her world building, and it is very evident in this book. It's also good if you want to figure out if that specific subgenre of near future kind of science fiction is for you. The downsides of this book is that it is very slow. There's not a whole lot of action and adventure. There are definitely parts that are very action oriented, but it's not super action heavy. It's very info dumpy, and because there's so much of this world that you just have to know and have to understand to be able to follow the plot line. And it's almost a little bit science fiction light, but I do think it is still a worthwhile read. And then the very last book, the book that I've saved for all those people who are really into science and just want to see the science done right, The Martian by Andy Weir. This is basically there is a manned mission to Mars, and one of the crew members gets left behind, and he has to survive on the surface of Mars until they can come back to get him. Now, this is written by a scientist, Andy Weir, who was very, very intent on getting the science right. So obviously there's a little bit of fiction based off of this because we can't do a manned mission to Mars yet. But he took a lot of the science that we have currently and extrapolated in a very kind of scientific way of where it might go. Orbital mechanics and stuff, that's actually how it works, like very, very science-based kind of story. The main character is very, very likable. So even though I'm not as into science, I really did like this book because I liked our main character. And additionally, this is the kind of story that we really understand. It's a story about about human resilience, right? He's living on Mars and he has to survive for like I don't remember how long. It's a really long time. I think more than a year. And it's a story that we can relate to where he's just trying to survive. Something goes wrong and he's got to fix it. And then something else goes wrong and he's got to fix it so that he can survive. And that's really relatable. Now, I would not recommend this if you are not into science because it is so science heavy that you'll either get glazed over reading it because you don't follow it, or you'll just skip it and then you're skipping a good chunk of the story. And then the other, additionally, like it is very series of unfortunate events style in that something goes wrong and then he fixes it. Something else goes wrong and then he has to fix it. And like having problem after problem after problem is just not necessarily a story for everybody. That was actually a part that I did not appreciate about this as much. But ultimately, I do still think it is a very worthwhile read. And yeah, and very science heavy. So there you go. That is it, you guys. That is my recommendation for 8 places that you can start if you are new to science fiction. Let me know down below, what are your favorite beginner science fiction books? Do you agree with me on my list? Do you disagree? Let me know down below. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.